conference, and thank you all for coming. Thank you especially to those contributors whom I wasn't able to read last night, so Maria Antoinette and Paul Lodge. But I should also say not just hello to you, but hello to, well, in principle, the whole world, because these events are being streamed live to everybody, and perhaps more disconcertingly, they're streamed live to ourselves, so you can see yourself as you speak. I should try not to look there. So this is an event which brings together people, universities, continents, cultures, projects, approaches, and periods. Most obviously, the day is a collaboration between myself and Tim Crane and his team, and between our two projects. My own project, which I've been running for this year and is about to finish, supported by the British Academy, on immateriality, thinking of the self in the long Middle Ages. And Tim's much, much larger project, compared to which mine is just a minnow in the sea of funding. But his project was supported by the Templeton Foundation, New Directions in Study of Mind. And having mentioned these projects, I should take the opportunity to thank the funders who made this possible, so the British Academy and the Templeton Foundation. So that's the first bringing together. But my project itself is a collaboration. It takes place under the British Academy's International Mobility Scheme. And the idea of this scheme is to bring together not just individual scholars from the UK with people in sort of generally far-flung countries with different cultures, but also to bring together their departments. And so this is a cooperation between, on one side, the philosophy department in Cambridge, or philosophy faculty in Cambridge, and the philosophy department of Peking University, and then of myself and a particular historian of philosophy in Beijing, Tianyue. And I think this is quite an interesting cooperation, partly because you could hardly imagine two philosophy departments more different than Cambridge and that of Peking University in their size. And Peking has an enormous department, and Cambridge has a tiny one, and in their general orientation. Whereas there's much less difference, perhaps, between myself and my colleague Tianyue, who works on, specialised on the Latin tradition of medieval philosophy. I'd hoped that Tianyue was going to be able to be here virtually through Skype or something like that. And for various reasons of timing, that's proved impossible. But he has sent a message, and that justifies to some extent my listing this introduction under both our names. So let me read out this little message from him. Dear colleagues, it's a great honour for me to have this opportunity to greet you from Beijing. Since we're still in the Spring Festival period in China, which lasts until the 15th day of the first week of the month, so to the 22nd of February, please allow me above all to say Happy New Year to you all. As you may have known, we have already had two successful conferences on this theme of immateriality in the last year, one in Cambridge in the summer, the other in Beijing in the winter. Thanks to the generous support from the British Academy, the University of Cambridge, and Peking University, we had a good opportunity to gather two international teams to work on this unusual theme. I call it an unusual theme because reflections on immateriality, especially those focusing on incorporeal beings such as separated souls, angels, and God, seem to be one of the most unattractive features of Western medieval philosophy, so far as contemporary philosophers are concerned, as I mentioned in his talk in Beijing. That's to say Tianyue, just want to add that this theme also puzzled Chinese thinkers in their early encounter with scholastic philosophy in the 17th century, as we learned in another of the talks given to the Beijing conference. As early as the so-called axial age, Chinese thinkers were extraordinarily concerned with the practical life of human beings in this material world, and showed little theoretical interest in the realm beyond the empirical world. As one of my colleagues showed in the Beijing conference, even religious Taoism, one of the most spiritual elements of Chinese traditional culture, takes the body as the center of its religious practices. Nevertheless, these two conferences enabled us to hear various voices from different traditions and from different perspectives. We gladly noticed that the challenges to explain human beings and their unique status in the material world were extended via the early modern discussions to contemporary philosophy. This is especially true in the field of the philosophy of mind. It seems that the scholastic approach to immaterial entities and their specific activities didn't die with the long Middle Ages. Moreover, contemporary approaches to problems such as the ontological status of the mind, the nature of consciousness, also provide new perspectives for historians of philosophy to re-examine the old material. From the programme which I was sent, I'm so glad to see that this lively exchange between historians and philosophers between different cultural traditions and between different approaches is continuing. It's a great pity for me not to be able to attend this event. What consoles me is that one of our students, Tianyue, will contribute a paper. That indeed will be the first paper after my introduction. And he ends by saying he hopes that we all enjoy the conference. As this message indicates, this conference and those in the series bring together, not therefore just different people in different countries, but different periods and traditions of philosophy. My own notion of not the Middle Ages, but the long Middle Ages, includes already thinkers such as Descartes and Spinoza and Leibniz, who are generally cut away from the longer tradition to which they belong. The scope of the conference in Beijing went further than the long Middle Ages to include German idealism and Marxism, as well, as you've heard, as Chinese philosophy. And we've also been very anxious to make links with contemporary philosophy. And we very much hope that we'll succeed, especially this time. It's still the case, looking at the programme, that the emphasis in the papers is very much historical, though we're certainly having one non-historical paper. However, looking around at all the participants, not just those giving papers, but those engaging in the discussion, and many of you, I think most of you, have a background more in contemporary philosophy, and so we very much hope with that sort of discussion. On the one side, I think that there may be ways in which thinking about philosophy of the past can help the contemporary discussion. This is something which I think some historians of philosophy put too much of an emphasis on, as if that were the main purpose of the history of philosophy, but it's certainly something which can happen. But on the other side, and perhaps more selfishly, contemporary philosophy can be enormously useful for studying and understanding the philosophy of the past. And that's why I look forward rather greedily to the papers which will follow. So that's the introductory, as a welcoming part of my little talk, which is combined with Tianyue's message. Now I'd like to throw out a few ideas, but I really do stress this is throwing out a few ideas by way of introduction. It's not, as you'll see very quickly, in any sense, a formal paper, but just to give you some idea of the rather inchoate state of my thoughts at the end of this first year of the project. I've been talking about bringing together, but I'd like to do some taking apart. taking apart of terms and concepts and their meanings, especially their contemporary resonance, and how they might be applied when one's talking about philosophy of the long Middle Ages. To most people now, the word material, bodily, and physical seem to be very close in meaning, if not synonymous. The word materialism is often used to label the view that everything is bodily or depends fundamentally on what is bodily. And physicalism is often employed interchangeably with materialism. It's true, though, some philosophers make a distinction, and they say that a physicalist holds that everything is a part of nature and can be explained by natural processes, but such an explanation may involve, for instance, forces such as gravity, which are not bodily in the ordinary sense. So you might want to call it materialism, in this equation between what's material and what's bodily. Still, I think everyone now would agree in denying that someone who maintains that there are thinking things which could exist independently of any bodies is a physicalist. When we look back to the long Middle Ages, the meanings of these terms come apart. We can't equate matter, or what is material, with body for various reasons. The most striking of these reasons is that according to one group of influential thinkers, there is bodily matter and non-bodily matter. Everything except God, including some sorts of things which are without bodies, has matter. And I don't want to go on about this because you'll hear much more about it in Elena's talk a little later on this morning. Now, there was only one group of thinkers which thought about matter in this way. Everyone, though, considered matter as a pair with form. Some thinkers, such as Aquinas, went as far as to say that even God could not make matter exist without some form. Others disagreed, and went on to develop an idea of matter nearer to modern conceptions of body. But it was never exactly the same. Neither term of the pair, form and matter, made sense when considered without the other. Moreover, whereas when we talk now about what is non-bodily or immaterial, we've little idea of what we mean. On the medieval view, what was immaterial was pure form. Medieval views about body were also diverse both from each other and from our views about body. Bodiness was indeed often, as it would be for later thinkers, characterized as extension in 3 dimensions. Though you need to put that into an intellectual context which conceptualizes the whole question of place differently from us. There were, however, some thinkers who thought that unextended, quantityless bodies were possible. Some thinkers, such as John Scott of Tianyue in the 9th century, seem to have understood bodiliness epistemically. Bodies are what we, at least in principle, might perceive with our senses. And then, of course, you have to bear in mind that in the period after 1277, angels were usually considered to have bodies, although bodies of very special sorts, which don't follow the ordinary rules for bodily things. Now, you might say that whilst these terminological differences are important to note, they do nothing to change the fact that, as Tianyue would put it in his message, thinkers in the long ages focused on incorporeal beings such as separated souls, angels, and God. That is to say, beings which are incorporeal according to both medieval and contemporary senses of the term, even if not all of them are immaterial on medieval views. And that this, as Tianyue went on to say, seems to be one of the most unattractive features of Western medieval philosophy for contemporary philosophers. It was exactly this sentiment which made me choose immateriality as the central theme for my project, though I think I laid the emphasis on its strangeness and incomprehensibility rather than its unattractiveness. I thought, rather than concentrate on the various features of medieval philosophy has in common with contemporary analytic philosophy, as many of those in the subject like to do, why not concentrate on what is most strikingly different about it and try to grasp better how these incorporeal entities were perceived and why such a large role was given to them. Yet, as I want to go on to explain, I've ended up by wondering whether this feature of philosophy in the long Middle Ages really is so distinctive. So consider the third of the terms I mentioned a few moments ago, physical and its derivative, physicalism. It might seem that we could capture the peculiarity, even the unattractiveness of medieval philosophy by saying that because of the role of separated souls, angels, intelligences, and God, it flies in the face of physicalism, whereas, by contrast, many of us, most philosophers now, are physicalists, and many of those who don't consider themselves physicalists would nonetheless balk at some or all of these things, separated souls, angels, intelligences, and God. But do these entities in their role fly in the face of physicalism? The reason why physicalists tend to say that there's nothing which is bodiliness, except perhaps for certain sort of scientific exceptions, like the force of gravity, is because they are trying to, they say that there's nothing which is outside the realm of nature, and they take it as obvious that nothing non-bodily is part of nature. But why should one think like that? So let's start off with the question of God. First of all, I think it would be wrong to say that people who are talking about God and who consider that God is incorporeal, so certainly God is not corporeal, it's not a bodily thing, are thereby talking about some incorporeal thing, because it just seems wrong to consider God either when we're talking about it in contemporary terms or when we're talking about medieval philosophy or philosophy of any period as some sort of a thing at all. However, surely if you admit God, you're saying that there is something as well as a natural realm. So if you're admitting God into your explanations of things, you're going beyond giving an explanation of nature in its own terms, and therefore going beyond physicalism. But this depends on the sort of God that you have in mind and the relationship between that God and nature. If you think of God as being able to make various sorts of choices, then this is certainly something, God is certainly something non-natural. But if God acts by nature and of necessity, then surely God, so far from being something outside the natural order, is its origin, if you like, its guarantor. And it's important to stress that both these conceptions of God were available in the Middle Ages. On the one hand, you have the conception of like the more anthropomorphic conception of God as something which wills, which comes from the Abrahamic religions, which dominate these cultures: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. However, there's a different conception of God, which comes from the Aristotelian Platonic tradition of philosophy, in which God is seen simply as something acting necessarily, And this conception of God is found not just in the Arabic Aristotelian tradition and in aspects of the Jewish tradition, but also in Latin philosophy, in the arts faculties. Now, it's not a conception that anybody would have endorsed as the ultimate truth, but it's a conception which many people in the arts faculties would have endorsed as what Aristotle thought the best rational conception we can come to, and what, for all intents and purposes, they would work with, whilst, on the other hand, admitting that's just the view of reason, by faith we accept something else. So it's not acknowledged as true, but nonetheless it's a live and important tradition. Then, so let's consider the next group of these immaterial things, the intermediate entities between God and human souls. Firstly, remember that here we may not be dealing always with things that are, well, certainly not things that are immaterial, but even with things that are non-bodily. So quite a lot of thinkers in the Christian tradition, when they're thinking about angels, are thinking about beings which are bodily, though in some rather special sort of way. This, however, is not the case with regard to the intelligences of Aristotelian or Platonized Aristotelian philosophy and its Arabic adaptations, or angels when they're considered along the same line as intelligences. But why are these non-corporeal beings not to be considered as part of nature? They are entities, the existence of which is argued for in a strictly scientific way to explain the phenomena, to explain cosmology, and also ultimately the ordering of nature in the world and aspects of human cognition. And so to come to souls, and especially considering separated souls, as Tianyue mentioned, or at least the separability of souls. First of all, it's important to stress that there are important currents in medieval philosophy in which there are no separable souls. Because so far as the dogmatic religious teaching is concerned, whilst the separability of the soul is part of Catholic doctrine, medieval Catholic doctrine, it's not part of Islamic doctrine, or even really straightforwardly in Judaism, where the hope for immortality is placed mainly, or perhaps entirely, in bodily resurrection. And that idea gets carried forward among some of the Jewish philosophers, and also in one of the most interesting of all the medieval philosophical traditions, the Kalami tradition of Islamic theology. Secondly, consider Averroes. Averroes is sometimes very misleadingly described as a monopsychist, as if he was somebody who thought there was one big soul for all human beings. In fact, what he says is, not there's the one soul for human beings, but there is just one intellect, or one sort of intellect with which human beings come into contact. But whereas the intellect engages in immaterial thinking, human beings are involved with it in a way which is purely corporeal. They can engage with this one intellect, which is engaged in immaterial thinking, through what's happening in their inner and outer senses, and these are purely corporeal events, though they provide the basis for this sort of superhuman and extra-human activity. And whilst Averroes has almost no influence within the Arabic tradition, he's very important for the Jewish tradition, and again for arts masters in the Christian tradition, many of whom accept what he says as the best rational theory, although in the way I was speaking of before, they admit that it can't be reconciled with faith. And there's also knowledge of the rather different views of Alexander of Aphrodisias, who quite plainly denies that there's any separable part of the human soul. So, for instance, Alexander's view was considered by Puritan in the 13th century to be the most rationally persuasive view. Though again, of course, he admitted that it was wrong because it contradicted the faith. And in a modified version, and with the same sort of caveats, it was put forward in the 16th century by Pomponazzi. But of course, there are many medieval philosophers who do think there are separable souls, and indeed separated souls. But I wonder whether even this position should be ruled out, or whether we should rule out this position from being a physicalist one, if the separable souls are argued for on the grounds of the best scientific evidence. Now, obviously, once one brings in questions of merit and demerit and grace and so on, you have to do with a conception which is certainly not physicalist, because it has to do with a way of thinking of God, which is quite different from the way of thinking about God, which, as I was suggesting, is reconcilable with a physicalist view of things. I'd just like at this stage to do one further bit of pulling apart, even though I know it's a bit of a parenthesis, because I think it's quite important for one of the main purposes of today's meeting, which is to compare and contrast contemporary approaches to the mind and earlier ones, to the mind and separability or inseparability from the body. So contemporary thought about this question very often begins from our idea of consciousness. We're all aware of our consciousness, and we ask how this phenomenon, which we each know from the inside, is related to the biological and physical workings of our body, and whether it, so for instance my consciousness, could go on existing even when my body has ceased to function. I want to suggest that there's a mismatch between this line of speculation and anything we can find in texts from the broadly Aristotelian medieval tradition. Because in these texts, there is no direct notion of consciousness. And of course, it's a very different matter with regard to some 17th century thinkers, such as obviously Descartes. Now, I say there's no notion of consciousness in these broadly Aristotelian thinkers, because the various mental experiences we all include under consciousness were divided up into the workings of the outer and inner senses, which were considered to be bodily organs functioning in an entirely bodily way, and the workings of the intellect, that's to say, reasoning about universals, which is usually considered to be incorporeal. Indeed, one might want to say that for these philosophers, there was no one homogeneous group of experiences which could be described as mental, so that even talking about the mind in the contemporary sense is inappropriate for most medieval philosophy. But this pulling apart is or should only be partial, because some medieval philosophers do come to a notion of consciousness in an indirect way through the idea of the self and self-consciousness. These philosophers, though, are scattered in the period, both geographically and chronologically. They include Augustine, Avicenna and many in his tradition, such as I think Surawadi, about whom we're going to hear, and some 13th century writers such as John Paul or Levy. They don't include, for instance, Averroes, and nor, I think, though some experts would disagree strongly, do they include Aquinas. One way this parenthesis might relate to the main direction of my remarks is this. There seems to be a stark contrast between consciousness and the external scientific view of things. Even, or perhaps especially, the scientific view of the neural events, which are related to, some would say underlie, the events of this inner mental world. There is less of a contrast, and possibly no contrast at all, with a scientific view of things and bodily changes occurring in the senses, and non-bodily changes occurring in a completely mechanical and orderly way in the intellect. So that's the end of this parenthesis. I'd just like to try to pull things together. And to do so, to recall a paper which impressed me very much. At first I thought it had little relevance to or to medieval discussions, but I came to think that wasn't the case, which was given at the conference in July by Jane Heal, who I think is going to come along later today. She was talking about materialism and immaterialism from the standpoint of a contemporary philosopher. Now, for her, the difference between materialism and immaterialism, and I think in the terminology I've been using, she probably would have said physicalism and non-physicalism, is between those, the physicalists, who, usually on the basis of logical atomism, consider statements about human choices and values to be less than properly scientific and of little value for understanding how the world is, and the immaterialists or non-physicalists who, as Jane Heal put it, offer an alternative picture. Now, she developed this picture in terms of pragmatism. She said the world is open to various sorts of conceptualization. Our concepts are our devices to help us live and cope with the world, and they're shaped by the interests of agents in their community and living life, but also by the world, which may be more or less hospitable to them. There's nothing, I think, like this pragmatism in the philosophy of the long Middle Ages. But what I want to suggest is that there is a contrast analogous to the one which Jane Heal discovers within contemporary philosophy between a scientific, indeed you might call it a physicalist view, which uses the best science of the day, which of course is not our science, and on the other hand, a view which considers that physicalist view inadequate or misleading, and that view is developed not like the contemporary one through pragmatism, but rather by introducing a more or less anthropomorphic God. So, to put the matter even more crudely, we are apt to contrast medieval philosophy, which is supposedly founded for all its sophistication and logical wizardry, on a view of the world that involves mysterious unnatural entities repugnant to science, to contrast that with the scientific approach of later philosophy, which often, in its more recent manifestations, adopts physicalism as a starting point. I suggest that rather there is a contrast between two philosophical approaches in different periods, today, in modern times, and throughout the long Middle Ages. The one embraces physicalism, even if we wouldn't, anachronistically applying contemporary science to it, consider it physicalist. The other rejects it to allow some slack for what is especially human. And if that's right, then I have to admit that having started out to inquire about what is distinctive in medieval philosophy, I've ended by noticing how a very deep underlying problem, tackled but never resolved by medieval philosophers, is still being tackled by philosophers today, who similarly cannot resolve it. Thank you. So I also have to act as my own chair, and Tim will be chairing this afternoon. So we have sort of 10 minutes for any questions or comments.